This video is sponsored by Halbe Ramen. Stick around to see how you can get 15% off these super unique and high quality frames. In this video, we are diving deep into shutter speed, how it works in photography, and how you can use the different creative effects that shutter speed can provide. Back when I started out as a landscape photographer, I just smacked a 10-stop filter in front of my lens and 2-minute long exposed everything. Today, I'm a little bit more deliberate in how I use shutter speed. My name is Mads Peter Iversen. I make weekly videos about landscape photography where I take you out into the field, take some new photos, share what I do, or I stay back home in the studio and discuss various topics related to landscape photography. As many of you seem to have enjoyed the recent video I made about aperture, one of those very basic fundamental photography videos, why not just make one about shutter speed too? It is, after all, a few years ago since I made my last video about shutter speed, and in the meantime I've of course learned a lot of new stuff. Shutter speed is simply the time your camera shutter is open and your sensor is exposed to light. And that is why it's also known as exposure time, the time where the camera collects light. So logically, the longer time your shutter is open, the more light the camera collects, resulting in a brighter photo. And the shorter, the less light it collects, resulting in a darker photo. Shutter speed is measured in seconds. It is often displayed in fractions of seconds because we tend to use shutter speeds faster than a second, such as 1/10th of a second, 1/60th of a second, and 1/500th of a second, all the way up to 1/4000th of a second, which is usually the fastest shutter speed most cameras can provide. The faster the shutter speed, the less light, the darker the photo. We can also go the opposite way, so half a second is faster than 1/10th, resulting in a brighter photo due to the longer exposure time, and we can extend the exposure time up through 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, all the way up to usually 30 seconds. Most cameras also have a bulb mode where you can extend the shutter speed beyond 30 seconds. You can compensate for the brightness of a photo at a given shutter speed by changing the settings of aperture or ISO, or use a neutral density filter. I will not go deeper into aperture or ISO in this video, but I have dedicated videos to either subject on my channel. So this was all the technical stuff you need to know about shutter speed in relation to exposure and the brightness of your photo. But let's dive into some of the fun and creative stuff related to shutter speed, motion blur. I'm of course showing a lot of photos in this video, and if you want to learn how I compose those photos, be sure to get my 2 ebooks on exactly that topic. They're super easy to read with minimal text and plenty of examples. In both ebooks I cover 9 to 10 different compositional tools, and in the final chapter I put it all together and show several examples where I combine and use them. There are links to those ebooks down in the description of the video. Motion blur appears either when whatever you are photographing moves in the scene and you are not using a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the moment, or that you move the camera while taking the photo and the entire photo comes out blurry. The longer the shutter speed, the more motion blur you create. For landscape photographers, with a few exceptions, it is essential to avoid motion blur due to camera movement, as we generally want tag-sharp photos. This is why we usually use a tripod. By using a tripod, we can keep the camera still for any amount of time, which generally should result in sharp and non-blurred photos. If you do get blurry photos despite using a tripod, check out my video up here in the corner where I cover and problem solve how to figure out where motion blur comes from. If you're hand-holding your camera and want to avoid motion blur due to camera movement, the general recommendation is to use a shutter speed equal to or faster than the value of your focal length. This means if you're photographing at 50mm, you should use a shutter speed of at least 1/50th of a second, and if you're shooting at 400mm, you should use a shutter speed of at least 1/400th of a second. However, with modern image stabilization, you can come away with sharp handheld photos at much slower shutter speeds. It does depend on several different factors, but I'm sure with a bit of experimentation you will find out where the threshold for sharp handheld photos is for you and your camera setup. Some landscape photographers are very much into what is called intentional camera movement, where they create almost impressionist paintings by moving their camera while exposing for their subject. It requires some experimentation and many tries, but you can create some fascinating photos. Both wildlife and sports photographers can also create some fascinating photos by using semi-slow shutter speeds while tracking a subject by moving their camera. In this way, the subject can turn out sharper than the surroundings and can create a strong sense of movement. This also requires many tries to get right. Besides tracking birds, if you want to train this skill, you can also go out to the side of the road and see if you can track cars. Just make sure you don't look like a pervert. However, for landscape photographers and cityscape photographers, the fun part of motion blur is how you can either blur parts of your photo or freeze time. Before we get started, it is important to know the fundamentals of how motion blur relates to both focal length and the distance between your camera and whatever you're photographing. So as you probably figured out by now, the faster your subject is moving, the faster shutter speed you need to freeze time, to freeze the action. As your subject moves over your screen, it takes a given amount of time to cross that distance. However, if you zoom in and, as an example, half the distance that your screen covers, it'll naturally take half the time for the subject to cross your screen, given the subject moves at the same speed. This means you'll need double the shutter speed to freeze the subject. Likewise, if you keep the same focal length but half the distance between the camera and your subject, it'll also take the subject half the time to cross your screen, and you'll again need twice the shutter speed to freeze the action. This is super relevant for wildlife photographers and sports photographers, but how do we landscape photographers benefit from this knowledge? If you're photographing a waterfall and aim for a certain amount of blur, but you, for compositional reasons, half the distance between the camera and the waterfall, you'll need twice as fast a shutter speed to get the same length of blur on the streaks of water. That's because we are counting the time for the individual droplets to cross over your screen. And it's the same for waves or cars, if you want to include cars in your photos. So both distance to whatever you're photographing and your focal length counts when you need to choose your shutter speed. There is also a setting called shutter speed priority on most cameras. On Sony cameras, symbolized with an S, and on camera cameras, it's known as TV. As a landscape photographer, I rarely use this setting, as my first priority is to get my depth of field right, which is aperture dependent. So I usually use aperture priority. However, for wildlife and sports photographers where there is a lot of action and fast movement, this setting is invaluable, as you can set your shutter speed to a specific value and let the aperture and ISO vary relative to the overall lighting conditions in your scene. In scenes with water, especially breaking waves, I usually photograph in fully manual, because as the waves break, the scene will get brighter. If I was shooting in aperture priority, the camera would compensate for the increased brightness with a faster shutter speed, resulting in shorter streaks from the waves than I intended. So before we move on to some shutter speed examples, I want to show you this week's sponsor, Halbe Rahmen or Halbe Framing. Halbe Rahmen is a German framing company, and they make these super unique frames. So as you can see here, they have this magnetic technology where they have built magnets into the frame, so it's super easy to just pop off, take the glass off, put it aside, pop whatever print you have into the frame, put the glass back on, and then change into the frame. And whoop-de-doo, and now you have your print framed super easily. You can design the frames exactly as you want them, down to the millimeter on their homepage. They do not sell from stock, so every single frame is custom made in Germany and shipped from Germany. The frames are super high quality. You can choose between many different finishes, different kinds of glass, reflection-free glass or regular glass. And as you can see right here, the corners are really high quality. They just fit perfectly. There are no small gaps that looks unprofessional. And with the holes here on the backside, they are super easy to hang on the wall wherever you want to hang them. Or you can, as in this example, put them on a picture shelf. On the homepage, which is also in English, they have many resources to choosing the best frames for your specific print. So these frames are just quick and super convenient, and you can simply just change the print very easily whenever you want a new print or new art on your wall. So if you need a new frame for your prints, be sure to check out Halbe Rahmen. Get 15% off via the link and the coupon code down in the description of this video. With the release of this video, it is a limited offer on about a month. I may be able to extend it, but be sure to benefit from the 15% off by using the coupon code down in the description of this video. And now let's get back to some shutter speeds. In this section of the video, I will start with examples where you could consider using longer shutter speeds like 5 to 30 seconds, then semi-long shutter speeds between 1/10 and a couple of seconds, and then into faster shutter speeds all the way up to 1/4000, and finally how you can combine different shutter speeds to make some incredible landscape photos. The most obvious place where you need longer shutter speeds are during night, where the lack of light forces you to increase the shutter speed to compensate for that lack of light. You can obviously compensate for that with an open aperture and increased ISO, and you will have to optimally combine the settings relative to what you are photographing to get the best possible result. In the case for the Milky Way, you can start with the 500 rule, and for Northern Lights, I find that the faster the lights move, the faster shutter speed I also want. To get a proper exposure for the foreground, I usually make a longer exposure for the foreground and combine the clean foreground photo with the sky photo in Photoshop. If you're aiming for that ethereal look with a completely flat ocean, it is also the longer shutter speeds you want to use. Everything from 10 seconds and up to 2 and 4 minutes will give you this look. The longer the shutter speed, the more smoothed out the ocean will get. Do note that the effect will be limited beyond 2 minutes. You may also need to use something like a 10-stop filter to achieve those shutter speeds. I recently made a video all about long exposure photos. I do like the ethereal effect in many of the photos, but in one example there is no doubt I prefer the faster shutter speed over the long exposure. Likewise, if you wish to smooth out the clouds, you'll need the longer shutter speeds too, obviously depending on how fast they move. So it is as usual down to personal taste, intention, and what can be accomplished with the specific scene. Back in the days, I also used 30 seconds or more speeds to smooth out waterfalls. They do indeed look very ethereal, and it's an effect I was very fascinated by as a new landscape photographer. However, over the years I found my taste to change, where the bigger the waterfall I photograph, the faster the shutter speed I want. And that brings us into the semi-long shutter speeds of 1/10 of a second to 2-ish seconds. When I want to create action in my seascapes, yet don't want the scene to be super chaotic, I use those shutter speeds. With breaking waves, waves crashing against cliffs, waves crashing against a beach, water running off cliffs, or back into the ocean from a beach, you can get some really cool photos. Here you show the motion of the water, yet because of the semi-long exposure, you still keep some texture in the water. It's a kind of controlled action. A famous location for those streaks is the ice beach in Iceland. I absolutely love photographing here, and hours pass by so fast. It does require a bit of technique to avoid motion blur and shaking your camera, but when you capture those streaks in combination with a sharp piece of ice, it just looks so good. You can play with both the water coming in and the water going out. It's the same effect with streams, rivers, smaller waterfalls, where you keep the motion of the water by smoothing out the bubbles and foam on the water, yet not so much you lose the texture. Occasionally I find that these long or semi-long exposures work for waterfalls, but it is more the exception than the rule. Smaller or complex waterfalls that run along some cliffs are usually where I want to use the slower shutter speeds. So moving into the faster shutter speeds, it's all about avoiding motion blur and freezing the moment. In scenes without movement, like silent mornings in a forest or in a heath area where there's nothing moving in the scene, then you can use all shutter speeds without getting motion blur as long as you use a tripod. This is generally relevant for us landscape photographers when we photograph on calm mornings, dark mornings, in the blue hour or after sunset. However, around seascapes, it can make a lot of sense freezing the moment when the waves crash against the cliffs. As mentioned, dependent on your focal length and distance to the wave, you may need a really fast shutter speed like 1/1000th of a second or even faster. This also means you need to both open the aperture and up the ISO for the desired brightness. That was the case in this example, where we were photographing on one of the beaches in Iceland. It was quite dark because it was cloudy and around sunset, but I just really wanted to capture the texture and power of those dramatic waves, so I really needed a fast shutter speed. On another visit to the same beach, where I had plenty of light, but the air was full of mist and spray due to the heavy winds, I also found that capturing the drama of the breaking waves made much more sense than trying to experiment with longer exposures. So as mentioned, with larger waterfalls, I prefer faster shutter speeds. In this example, the photo would not be half as dramatic if it wasn't for the small human in front of the waterfall and the fast shutter speed that really freezes the moment and captures all those frightening details in the waterfall. At other times, I simply just prefer the waterfalls to look more realistic. You still capture all the streaks of the falling water, you keep the sense of scale, and if the spray is being pushed around by the wind, you actually risk losing the sense of power if your shutter speed is too slow. I do have one exception in this photo from Skogafoss, but I guess it's the exception that confirms the rule. Here I wanted to capture how the spray was being pushed around by the wind, and I found that a semi-long exposure worked well, but in most circumstances I really want to freeze the moment of bigger waterfalls. In this example, I photographed with a drone and was forced to use a faster shutter speed to avoid the motion blur of the drone. But I find that just like the previous photo, freezing the water creates much more drama. Here are 3 different shutter speeds from the same waterfall, and you can see how the different shutter speeds creates very different perceptions of the same scene. And since I probably prefer the middle photo of these 3 photos, you can also see how composition and the specific waterfall plays in on the creative choices. If you do find waterfalls to be too chaotic, you can blend different photos with different shutter speeds together. I'll talk about that in a moment. You can probably also see in this video that I edit my photos, and if you want to learn how I edit my photos, be sure to enroll in my big post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. It's more than 19 hours with more than 30 videos. If you already know and use Lightroom, you can just use that and then jump into Photoshop from there. I personally use Camera Raw for all my raw editing, but Lightroom is built on Camera Raw, so it's the same editing algorithms and features. In this course, I cover all the different techniques I use to edit my photos, such as dodging and burning, blending layers, blending with luminosity masks, editing with luminosity masks, cleaning your photos properly, how to benefit from different kinds of atmosphere, how to edit with different kinds of atmosphere, how to add glow, how to make black and white photos, how to edit moody photos, how to edit sunset photos, how to edit waterfall photos, and much, much, much more. You can use the coupon code to get 15% off, that's equal to $45. There are links to the editing course down in the description of this video. For photographing or including animals, especially fast-moving birds in your scenes, you also want to keep a fast shutter speed as to freeze the movement of the animals. Puffins, or generally birds in flight, are great examples of this as they move very fast. Here I photographed these incredible sea cliffs and had some seagulls flying around in the scene. The fast shutter speed was necessary to freeze them in their flight. If you use too slow of a shutter speed, birds can end up being unintentionally blurred in a less aesthetic way. On recent trips to both Antarctica or Svalbard, I've been photographing from zodiacs moving around in the water, sometimes in quite heavy waves, and here it is completely essential to use the fast shutter speed as to avoid the motion blur, and in this photo I captured out the front window of a bus. A fast shutter speed was also necessary to freeze the movement. Over the past couple of years, I've also been fortunate enough to photograph a couple of erupting volcanoes in Iceland. As lava is liquid, the shutter speed also highly influenced the perception of the photo. In most circumstances, I also prefer the faster shutter speeds as they complement and shows the drama of an erupting volcano more than the slow shutter speeds do. So there are many good reasons to use fast shutter speeds in landscape photography. If you're into editing, you can also combine different exposures. One way is to combine a fast shutter speed photo of the big waterfall in the background with a semi-slow shutter speed of the foreground stream. Alternatively, you can mix both a long exposure and a fast shutter speed photo and reduce the opacity of the foreground layer or mask in specific parts. This technique combines the smoothness of the long exposure with some strong texture from the fast shutter speed exposure. And of course, if you want to learn much more about editing your photos, be sure to enroll in my big Photoshop for Landscape Photographers post-processing course. If you want to learn more about composition, be sure to check out my ebooks. There are links to everything down in the description of the video. I hope you learned a lot from this video. Be sure to subscribe if you want to learn even more. See you next time.